afternoon. I'm Dan Weinberg, and you're watching virtual book signing here at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago as usual. Well, we are certainly proud to have the two gentlemen we have today. James Bud Robertson Jr., one of the most distinguished names in Civil War historiography, a PhD from Emory University. He's presently an alumni distinguished professor emeritus at Virginia Tech. He's executive director of the U.S. Centennial Commission, was, I should say, a recipient of every Civil War prize imaginable, I suppose. He's a lecturer with national acclaim, the author of more than 20 books, including General A.P. Hill, Soldiers Blue and Gray, Civil War, America Becomes One Nation, and of course Stonewall Jackson, the man, the soldier, the legend, which was award-winning and a basis for a film, Gods and Generals, which many of you I know have seen. By the way, I should mention, while we're live, if you want to email in questions for either of our authors, don't forget to do that, and put your first name and where you're from so we can shout out at you and know who you are. Today, for Bud Robertson, his latest book, The Untold Civil War, Exploring the Human Side of War, edited by Neil Kagan, with innovative illustrated books in here. That's what he does, innovative illustrated books, and it's a beautiful, gorgeous coffee table book with content. That's how I kind of look at this.
Thank you.
National Geographic produces it, 352 illustrated pages. We'll show you some of those. $40, 132 stories, 475 beautiful and rare illustrations. And I love it for showing artifacts instead of just illustrations. You're showing artifacts as illustrations, and for that you be commended. Dickson is a BA from Virginia Military Institute, a while ago, I guess, not that long, but MA, University of Richmond, PhD, University of Virginia. He worked in the U.S. intelligence community from 1985 to 1996, then becoming Commandant of Cadets at VMI. He's a Special Forces officer in the U.S. Army Reserve and a professor of military studies at Joint Forces Staff College at National Defense University. He's the author of two books before this for the general reader, Civil War for Dummies and World War II for Dummies, actually two interesting books that I think probably did fairly well. And his Almanac of American Participation in World War II was a selection of the History Book Club. Today, his latest book, Sustaining Southern Identity, Douglas Southall Freeman and Memory in the Modern South. Louisiana State University Press, 314 pages, and is $42.50. Now, before a couple of years ago, I was looking for a sculpture from a specific artist, and it brought me down to Athens, Georgia. I was doing this on the internet, and I noticed just before the zip code, in parentheses, it said Federal Occupation Code. So there's still a South going out there, I know, still ready to maybe fight this war. In this book, you asked the question, Keith. Let's start out with you. You're going to please give us an idea of how you came to this book, why this book now, and generally what it is. I know that you asked the question, what is the relationship between memory and history and identity? And I'm going to show a chart while you talk about this, if you'd like. Please give us an idea of how the inception of the book began.
Well, the one thing that remains constant in Southern history, I think, and in the Civil War in general, is the persistence of the idea of the war, and especially in the American South, the persistence of a particular memory about the war and how the war is remembered and how it is commemorated and how it is presented. And oftentimes that has been taken for granted as a point of study, it's something of a mystery. Nobody really knows why it happens. It's just either Southerners are still mad and can't get over it, or they haven't recognized the true measure of defeat, and that times have moved on. But nonetheless, there's a persistence here of Southern perceptions of the war and what it means. And the problem, I think, over time has been that Southerners have found it extremely difficult to articulate what it is, because it goes to the very heart of who people are and how they try to express themselves in a way that is understood by others. And in fact, Faulkner, at the heart of Faulkner's novels, is this inability to explain a love for the South or what the South means to others who are not Southerners. And so I took that as a challenge to try to explain the sources of that sense of particular identity, that self-identification that marks Southerners throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries, and to explain how that is promulgated, how that is revealed. And history is the main. It's the main way that is revealed and sustained over time. And I believe the man who did that better than anyone else is Douglas Southall Freeman.
What is his role in your book?
Well, Freeman is the centerpiece. He is the guide to examining where does this sense of identity come from. How is it expressed? How is it presented? And how does it exist as a touchstone even today, as a part of the collective memory of and identity of Southerners? And of course, Douglas Southall Freeman was a historian of the Confederacy, of the Army of Northern Virginia, a masterful researcher and extraordinarily gifted writer. But he was also a newspaper editor. He wrote all the editorials for the Richmond News Leader from 1915 until 1949. He had 2 radio broadcasts, one at 8 in the morning and one at 11, in which he'd talk about the news, talk about local events. And so here is a man who was deeply ingrained in the life of Richmond, Virginia, but also very much a representative of white Southerners during this time, and everything he presented to his audience, either literary audience or his newspaper audience or his radio audience, was tied in many ways to who we are, why we do what we do, what is important to us. Do not forget the past. It serves as a touchstone for the present and carries us through to the future. And of course, Freeman takes Virginians through the First World War, the Great Depression, the Second World War, and even into the Cold War. But Freeman's message never changes. It's this return to memory, return to identity, return to a sense of who we are and why we should maintain our remembrance of the past as it sustains us in crises now and will sustain us in the future.
Bud, I want to ask you the same thing. How did we get to this particular book? Why did you do this book in the way you did it?
For several years, I did a weekly vignette, 4-minute vignette for National Public Radio. It started out, none of us thought it would last very long, but it ended up being 7 years and 350 broadcasts. Basically, what I always sought to do was to insert a human aspect into history. I think today too many history teachers teach history from a demographic, statistical, or some other non-human aspect, but the Civil War is really a very human struggle. And throughout my career, I had kept notes on these little obscure but human and fascinating events that struck my fancy. And in the course of those broadcasts, I emphasized that. And year before last, the National Geographic Society contacted me about putting together a bulk of those broadcasts into a book, which they would illustrate it. And it was an exciting project to do. The book is not an entree with a single course to it. I mean, a meal with a single entree. It's a banquet of hors d'oeuvres, 130 plus tiny little events most of which you never heard of, such as Why Lincoln Grew a Beard, but fascinating, I think. And the book is done extremely well because I think it has touched a nerve. It shows people that underneath the Civil War is emotion. And as I have taught college students for a half century, unless you understand the emotions of the Civil War, you can never understand the war itself. And this is what we try to do. And there are, I think, little stories in here that will make you laugh, hopefully. Also, there are little stories in here I hope that will make you cry. And if that succeeds, then the book will be a success.
Well, as you say, this is on the human side of the war, and here at the bookshop, we have many historical artifacts, and it's the story behind the artifacts that propels them. Yes. So you can understand where this artifact came from, why it was produced, how it was used, and in what human way. And that's what I love about this book also, that you're showing an artifacts as artifacts and using those to humanize all sorts of events throughout the war.
And that human aspect of the war has never gone away. I mean,
No.
that's essentially the why the Civil War is such a centerpiece of American life, is those human dimensions of that war and have not dissipated. And they're powerful. They tend to be. They still are powerful stories that affect people over time.
I'm going to ask both of you, is Freeman still a relevant, I know your book is going to say yes, but how is to you as well, Freeman still relevant to today's readers? We've had, for instance, on his Washington book, we've had Ron Chernow's wonderful work, almost 1,000 pages. And, I keep thinking about Freeman in a way as being one Southerner looking at other Southerners. How is he relevant today?
Oh, well, when I was growing up, he was everyone's guru. I mean, you thought about Lee, you thought about Freeman. It was 1-2 in rapid fashion. I never had the honor to meet Dr. Freeman. I was in college when he died, but I was a close friend of his widow, and I consider that a great honor. He was just a very meticulous historian who spent inordinate hours to make sure what he found was sufficient, and he unearthed so much that no one knew. And he produced 2 works that are just basic reference works, I think, still in Civil War history, as R.E. Lee has been challenged many times, but it's never been superseded. And of course, my favorite is his 3-volume work on Lee's lieutenants, in which he talks about the brigade, division, and corps commanders more than he does Lee. And he just, if nothing else, he set a base from which all subsequent Confederate historians have stood and worked.